a lecture demonstration on Refugee Studies and Indian Writing in English by Dr. Dilip Kumar Das from the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. May I now invite Dr. Das, please.
Okay, so in this session we're going to discuss Hannah Arendt's pioneering essay on the characterization of the refugees, and 3 chapters from Deep Haldar's Blood Island. I will also be making a few references to The Hungry Tide, which has, as one of its central lines of action, the story of the Morijjapi massacre, which is presented in the form of a fictional letter written by a retired teacher and social activist to his nephew. And if you've read The Hungry Tide, this section is set apart in the typography from the rest of the book. It's in italics. The entire Nirmal's letter to Kanhai is presented in italics to distinguish it from the main story, the main plot, as it were. But this is a very central line of action in The Hungry Tide. And since I wanted to focus on basically refugees' self-representation, Arendt herself was a refugee, I didn't actually bring in The Hungry Tide in any major way, but if you've read The Hungry Tide, you can see the connections. So, Arendt, We Refugees was a very important essay. I said this had a big influence on a lot of the early work in refugee studies, and Egon Kunze's essay is very clearly influenced by this. And as you can see, like in Kunze's essay, We Refugees does not mention land, does not mention place. It mentions home, but we'll see what home means in Arendt and how it's very different from what home means in Blood Island. Now, Arendt's essay is about the rootlessness of the refugee. And we've talked about this whole notion of roots, place, rootedness, etc. That is the assumption that the condition of refuge is a condition of being uprooted from one's own culture, one's language, one's social context, one's homeland. And it is therefore founded on what I think I called an essentialist understanding of place. That place constitutes, the place of habitation constitutes a kind of essence, an essential core of our sense of who we are. And that this was kind of a little somewhat overstating the case. Place is not, as Lisa Malky argues, place is not an essential core of identity. Nevertheless, place has a tremendous amount of significance for our sense of who we are. Now, what is it that causes the rootlessness of the refugee? And we have this passage in Arendt, which is point number 1. We lost our home, which means the familiarity of everyday life. We lost our occupation, which means the confidence that we are of some use in this world. We lost our language, which means the naturalness of reactions, the unaffected expression of feelings. We lost our relatives in the Polish ghettos, and our friends have been killed in concentration camps, and that means the rupture of our private lives. So you can see what exactly she means by the roots here. Home, and we'll see what home really means. Occupation, language, relations. The last 3 very obviously referring to the social conditions of existence rather than the geographical or spatial conditions of existence. Now, what does this rootlessness produce? The rootlessness results in a sense of being alienated from community. Because they are rootless, they are not able to identify with anything that's stable. And this kind of an identification with others is the foundation of community. The word community comes from the Latin communis, which is again from another Latin word called munus. That means the gift that we give to one another, that establishes bonds of commonality between us. You know that we South Asians have a very common practice. We gift food. There are many communities, non-modern, non-Western communities, which, kind of cyclically exchange food. So if I give you, let's say, I love non-veg, if I give you, say, some nice, lovely mangsho koshai, mutton, you're not supposed to return the container back to me like that. You fill it in with something and give it to me. And then I must reciprocate. So the structure of the gift, as Marcel Mauss says in one of the most important theoretical works on the gift, called The Gift. Mauss says that gift relations are founded upon a number of conditions, 3 obligations. The obligation to give, the obligation to receive, and the obligation to reciprocate. So he compares gift relations with commodity relations, which do not have these obligations. Gift relations, the very structure of gift relations, munus, gift, is what builds community on bonds of commonality. The loss of identity makes such community impossible. So what they suffer, according to Arendt, is first a deep sense of social isolation, as a result of which they go interior. Arendt talks about the way in which the Jewish individual becomes a privatized existence. This privatization of the self is one imposed upon him by alienating social conditions. And 2 is self-sought, in order to evade the self-stigmatization as a Jew and a refugee. So this works both ways. It is both imposed and it is also sought. As a result of which, what happens to the Jewish refugee is a denial of one's own identity, a suppression of the past. Now, since it deprives the refugee from sociality, from the sphere of sociality, and drives the refugee deeper into self-isolation and privacy, it also results in the loss of political community. Because political consciousness depends upon a common identification with people disadvantaged similarly. It is only when you have a sense of the disadvantage that you have, and then begin to understand that it is not you yourself, because of your personal feelings, who suffers this disadvantage, but that other people belonging to your group, your class, sharing some important characteristics with you, also suffer the same thing. Now, how does one get to know that? Satya P. Mahanti, in a very important essay called The Epistemic Basis of Identity, talks about these consciousness-raising groups. You've heard of consciousness-raising groups, women's groups, gay groups, groups of people with HIV. And what these consciousness-raising groups do is, first, they kind of work through a sociality, establish commonalities, establish bonds of sociality, out of which emerges a political consciousness. So you can see Arendt's argument The refugee's deep alienation, sense of rootlessness, results not only in the loss of sociality, it also results necessarily in the loss of political consciousness. As a result of which, the refugee is very careful to avoid any kind of political stance. As she puts it, lacking the courage to fight for a change of our social and legal status, we have decided instead, so many of us, to try to change our identity. Whatever we do, whatever we pretend to be, we reveal nothing but our insane desire to be changed, not to be Jews. Now, so you see how that rootlessness is ultimately a social experience. Its origins are in one's interpersonal relations or social interactions with others. Now, what does this loss of political consciousness mean? And Arendt is making a very, very fundamental point. A few years, 3 years exactly, after she wrote We Refugees, she wrote another essay called The Rights of Man, What Are They? In 1946. This was in response to the concept that was being promoted then of human rights. So she writes this, is what are the human rights? What are the rights of man? And there she coins a phrase, the right to have rights. What is this strange thing, the right to have rights? Look through the Indian Constitution if you haven't. We have a preamble, we have the union, we have citizenship, then we have Part 3, fundamental rights. Nowhere do you find an article in the Indian Constitution which says every citizen of India shall have the right to have rights. It says every citizen of India shall have right A, right B, right C, right D, right E, but not the right to have rights. So what does Arendt mean by this peculiar term, the first right? What she's talking about there is a philosophical concept. That is, the right, the philosophical right on which the entire system of democracy, the entire system of juridico-legal rights comes to be founded. Since it is the very foundation of democracy, democratic constitutions do not name it. Okay, it is that on which the philosophy of democracy is founded and is therefore not named. But it is that unnamed center from which concept of all rights, human or political, from which all rights emerge. The right to have rights, the second rights is like your fundamental rights. Rights of freedom, rights against discrimination, right to equality before law, right to life and personal liberty, etc., etc. Now, it is the right that is implicitly granted by the nation state to its citizens. It is a right that is performatively produced in the preamble. We, the people of India, etc., etc. If you read the preamble is performative. Because what is it really talking about? It's talking about an act of doing. We, the people of India, do hereby adopt and give to ourselves this, our constitution. It is about a symbolic act. There is no we, the people of India, before India is constituted. How can there be a we, the people of India, before India comes into being? So it's the performative that actually performs itself retrospectively, the preamble. And it is there that this notion, the implicit or tacit notion of the right to have rights is contained. The problem with the refugee is a stateless person. The refugee does not belong to the state, to any state. And therefore, the question of the right to have rights is ruled out from the very first. The refugee is the one who does not have not only rights, who does not have even the right to claim a right. Forget the right to exercise a right. Now, it is this condition, Arendt argues, that reduces the refugee to almost a subhuman level, or to the very base human level. Nothing but human beings. As she puts it, we expose ourselves to the fate of human beings who, unprotected by any specific law or political convention, are nothing but human beings. And a very important interpretation of this, I'm not going into the details because that was pretty high theory and difficult to understand. Giorgio Agamben. If any of you has had the misfortune to come into encounter with him, I would tell you, keep the book away. This is his book, Homo Sacer, where he interprets Arendt's essay. And what he says is that this reduction of the refugee to being mere human existence is a reduction of the human to mere biological life or bare life. The refugee's life is a biological existence or a biological non-existence. The refugee is bare life without the value that is implicit in the assumption of a human life. Now, what therefore constitutes the refugee-ness of the refugee, this essential rootlessness, is this withdrawal, these series of withdrawals, the withdrawal of sociality, the withdrawal of the right to have rights in the withdrawal of the state, and the withdrawal of law and the protective mechanisms of the social order. In other words, the refugee becomes a nobody. So then she talks about how at one point of time they were somebodies. We were somebodies whom people loved. And even the landlord knew that we would pay our rents regularly. We could go and buy food in the market. We could take the subway. That is, we had the freedom to live as we wanted, without disapproval of others, without stigma. But now we've become a little hysterical about people disapproving of us, and take the utmost care not to be disagreeable, not to reveal any signs of who we are. So damnably careful in every moment of our daily lives to avoid anybody guessing who we are, what kind of passport we have, where our birth certificates were filled out, and that Hitler didn't like us. Now, what is this condition that she is actually describing? It is a condition where self-isolation and the reduction to mere existence is not just imposed upon the refugee, but actively sought by the refugee himself or herself. So damnably careful. Okay. Now, this kind of a terrible self-denial, or what may be called self-abjection, a term that existential psychology uses, self-abjection, where one internalizes a stigma and conceals oneself because one feels that she deserves the stigma. Okay, it's a very common experience in people who have been marginalized. The internalization of prejudice, the internalization of stigma. So what is the kind of characterization of the refugee that Arendt is giving us? The refugee cannot escape this condition. This is the existential reality of the refugee. A very bleak picture. The question of resettlement doesn't arise because there can be no true resettlement. Those who do try to resettle, who do try to assimilate, are merely putting up a facade. And she gives us that caricatural story of Mr. Korn, who in Germany was 100% German, a German super patriot. When he was forced to flee to Czechoslovakia, he became a Czech patriot. Then he was forced to move to Austria and became an Austrian patriot. Then was forced to move to France and became a Frenchman by descent. And she says, we don't know what marathon changes will come over Mr. Korn in his subsequent thing. What is she trying to tell through the story of Mr. Korn? That those who try to assimilate try to build an identity which is superficial, therefore malleable, unstable, and always threatened, and hence effectively the same as loss of identity. She makes this distinction between those who isolate themselves and those who try to assimilate in that kind of binary that she sets up between the social pariah and the social parvenu. Parvenu is the social climber. The pariah and the parvenu are, as it were, the only two possibilities for the refugee. And the largest part of the essay is about this. So, you begin to ask the question, what is it that Arendt is really trying to do? Is this some kind of a self-masochism, self-flagellation? Is it some kind of a moaning about their condition that she is doing? What is the point she is trying to make? The point Arendt is trying to make, obviously, is to challenge these, to challenge the conditions that create such existence. But because she dwells so much on this condition in the essay, there is a sense that I felt in which she is unwittingly contributing to the very marginalization, dehumanization, degradation of the refugee that she is setting out to do. Does she have an alternative? Yes, but that comes right at the end of the essay, where she coins another term, conscious pariah. What is a conscious pariah? A conscious pariah is one who is conscious of his or her pariah or social outcast status. The conscious pariah is like the other pariah, also understands that he is not the same as other human beings. But he is conscious in the sense that he uses this outcast status in order to question and to challenge the conditions of that existence. That is what she means by conscious. When one becomes conscious of one's pariah status, that is, when one begins to reflect upon one's pariah status instead of unconsciously internalizing it, then begins the political consciousness. And what is this consciousness founded on? It is first founded on the move from self-isolation to sociality, what she calls Jewish sociality. She says that it's not we that are of so much concern, but the whole Jewish people. So the sense of a we, the sense of a whole people, the sense of a commonality of suffering, which is first social, can only then take on a political turn. My reading of Arendt is insightful but disappointing. Maybe disappointing for emotional reasons or something. Maybe disappointing because I like to be like her parvenus, an optimist. But I felt that the conscious pariah remains in We Refugees as merely a gesture, as merely a hope. Let me take a passage from Blood Island. Chapter 1, Jyotirmoy Mondol's narrative. Jyotirmoy Mondol is recounting to Deep Hallar their experience in Pakistan, in the village, in East Pakistan, the village that they flee from, their journey through East Pakistan, crossing the Indian border, entering into India, etc., and finally arrival in, via Dandakaranya, arrival in Marichapi. And at one point he is describing the conditions of life in a transit camp, Jogeshwar Dihi transit camp in Bengal, where he says his father Sukhchand, who was a school teacher, earns some money, the relief, 70 rupees, by teaching school children, teaching school there. Now one day what happens, a boy comes to him and asks him, "Sir, what is a refugee?" What has happened is that this boy was wandering around and then he was very hot and he was thirsty and he went to a house and knocked and a woman opened the door. And then she asked, "What?" He said, "I want some water." She turned around to another woman inside and said, "I thought he was a refugee, but he looks like a normal boy." So refugee is not a normal boy. And this fellow is confused. So he comes and asks Sukhchand, "Sir, what is a refugee?" And Sukhchand gives him the traditional UNHCR definition, somebody who is persecuted and has to leave home, etc., etc. But that rankles in him, because that's not precisely what it is. Then they're being shifted from Jogeshwar Dihi transit camp, herded into trucks, forcibly shifted to Dandakaranya. They don't want to go. They've been here for quite some time. His wife Rangababu has planted seeds, bottle gourd seeds, and they're kind of beginning to feel kind of established there when they are suddenly asked to shift. They don't want to go. But then the authorities say, "If you don't, we're going to stop your dole." So then Sukhchand, in sheer desperation, turns to the crowd and asks, "What are we?" And they shout back, not the UN definition. They shout back, "We are humanity's leftovers." I'll take a comparable incident in the Hungry Tide from the letter of Nirmal to Kanhai. This is in Morichapi. The government has set up the police blockade, police patrol boats there. Some of the villagers set out in a boat to get provisions. The police fire guns in the air, warning them, and they know that they won't be allowed. Then suddenly one of them shouts, "Amra Kara, who are we?" And they reply, "Bastu Hara, we are the dispossessed." Now this is not the same as Arendt's gesture. These are Arendt's conscious pariahs, where they are using their status as outsider, as pariah, as the leftovers of humanity, as the dispossessed. Not in order to internalize that, but in order to refuse and challenge that. That is why when they resist the action of the police and the goons, in chapter 2, Safal Haldar, one of the survivors, says, "1 year of dying by the dozens, yet carrying on with fire in our souls." Now, why is it that the refugees of Blood Island experience the condition of refuge in this manner very different from Arendt's refugee? I think the answer lies in their sense of collective sociality. They do not ask the question, who am I? They ask the question, who are we? We are humanity's leftovers. We are the dispossessed. It is this consciousness of we. Political consciousness begins with social consciousness. That's the first step. It begins in establishing bonds with other fellow sufferers. From there only can it move to political consciousness. So we see an immense amount of difference between Arendt's characterization of the refugee and the survivor's own characterization of their condition. And I would say the major difference is the survivors of the Maurice Japy massacre realize in concrete resistance what remains only a gesture or a hope in Arendt's essay. We will see what this leads to, however. Now, let's look at the sense of rootlessness. These people also experience a sense of rootlessness. As they say, who are we? We are the Bastu Hara. The refugee is called the Ud Bastu, one who is torn from the place of living. So the sense of being uprooted is very much a part of, or an essential component of, the experience of Arendt's refugee as well as these refugees. But what are the roots for them? The roots for Arendt, as we have seen, are home, then language, occupation, language, social relationships. The roots for these people are primarily home. Subsequently, the question of language. And barely the question of social relationships, because social relationships have never disappeared for them. They've always been conscious of the we. Language, yes, is a part of their identity. Safal Haldar says in chapter 2, somewhere in the midst of all this, he says our people married, had children, and they lived there and all that. But somewhere in the midst of this, we had this gnawing fear that if not our children, I'm almost quoting from the text, it's there, if not our children, at least their children will no longer speak this beautiful language of ours. We'll see another reference to language later, when they say their dream was to speak in the mother tongue and not having to learn the coarse Hindi of central India. So language plays a very important role, and language, we must realize, is the medium of sociality, the medium of social relations. So it's not that the question of social relations is completely absent in the consciousness of these refugees. It is very much there. But what primarily it is a sense of home. Now, what does home mean for Arendt, and what does home mean for these people? For Arendt, home is the site of domesticity. As she puts it, the familiarity of everyday life. Home is just the site of domesticity. What is home for these people? It is land. Home is grounded. Home is not just the confines of your domestic sphere. So what for Arendt is home is very different from what home means to these people. For them, home is the place of origin, the home place. And let's look at some of the extracts. This is the first one is from Mana Goldar's narrative. Mana Goldar she never saw East Pakistan. She was born in an internment camp called Mana camp, and hence her name Mana. And she's telling the story to Deep Haldar. And then she's telling, Haldar is reporting this. As a child, Mana would hear the refugees talk about the rain-fed lush greens of Opar Bangla, the Bangla on the other side. The joy of speaking in the mother tongue and not having to learn the coarse Hindi of central India, and gorging on fresh fish from the river with steaming hot rice. There's a passage in The Hungry Tide, again in Nirmal's letter, where one of the refugees, Kusum, is talking about their life in Dhanbad. They were sent to this internment camp in Dhanbad, where they had to work on laying tracks for a new rail line. And Kusum is telling Nirmal, this retired school teacher and activist, walking on iron, we longed for the touch of mud. Encircled by rails, we dreamed of the Raimangal in flood. Raimangal is one of the rivers. We dreamed of storm-tossed islands straining at their anchors, and of rivers that bound them in golden fetters, reflecting the sun. We thought of the high tide and the Mohanas mounting, of islands submerged like underwater clouds. By night, we remembered, we talked, and we dreamed. By day, coal and metal were the stuff of our lives. Let me move on to the third extract. They decide to go to Morijjapi. And Mana says, things were looking up. When they reach Morijjapi, they're setting up this village. They're working very hard. It was just forest, so they had to first build the shelters, the huts. And Mana tells Deep Haldar, things were looking up for those who had been homeless for so long. No one minded the toil, as they felt a sense of home with the same flora and fauna that they had left behind in Bangladesh. Fourth extract. This is Jyotirmoy Mondal, chapter 1. They have just reached Hasnabad. Hasnabad is their entry point to the Sundarbans. From Hasnabad, they travel by boats to Morijjapi. Hasnabad, Jyotirmoy Mondal telling his story. Hasnabad. Here, homeless wanderers smell good earth after more than a decade in dry land. Small mud islands are spread out against the sea at a distance. They think of the Padma-kissed land they used to call home. Do you get a sense of what they mean by home? Home is not the confines of one's domestic sphere. Home is the land, the people, domesticity, a whole cosmos, as it were. Home is a whole cosmos that involves everything. What kind of a relation do they have with this home? You see, what is most striking in these passages is the sense of a deep sensual attachment. Okay, the vision of the lush greens of Opar Bangla, the taste of fresh fish caught from the rivers, eaten with steaming hot rice, the touch of mud, the smell of the tide water. Okay. So what kind of a relation are we talking about here when we say home? Home is not just a place, a physical place. Home conjures up a whole lot of things, and many of them symbolic, many of them non-material, which cannot be objectively known or objectively expressed. which only the subjective imagination can capture. It involves the land, it involves a location, it involves the body in an intense relation with this location. It involves affect, emotion, not reason, not calculation. So you see how home means something entirely different for these people than it meant for. Now one may ask, why? Why did the Jew did not have such a sense of home? Well, perhaps because of the historic nomadism of the Jew. The Jew never had a home. And perhaps because of that, the Jew has been a wanderer, a nomad, a spatially shifting identity, of which Mr. Korn is the caricatural extreme. Perhaps Jews were not farmers, were not fisher folk. Jews were intellectuals or business people. Jews had very little dealing with land. So land was not a part of their existential reality in the way land was a part of existential reality for these people. But then we are looking for objective reasons there. We are already doing what social science does. We are looking for objective reasons, objective explanations. I had to give you that objective explanation to tell you how that's bullshit. It's not the objective thing. This is a deep subjective, deep affective bonding with land, which no objectivism can capture, which is why refugee studies would not turn to. No self-respecting refugee studies scholar would look at the Hungry Tide, or worse, this piece of journalistic trash, Blood Island. Okay, this would not figure. Ethnographic work would figure. Objective, observation, empirical data would figure. Now, what is it, to come back to the question, that they mean by home? The lush greens of Opar Bangla, the smell of tidewater region, the touch of mud. Well, they had this all the while. What was the problem then? Why did they leave that Opar Bangla at all? The Opar Bangla was so beautiful. Why couldn't the Opar Bangla make them hold on to it? Because of the violence, as Jyotirmoy Mondal says. Jyotirmoy Mondal begins his story by talking about what happened in their village. The village was the typical idyllic, of course, colored by memory. The typical idyllic. Nostalgia paints a beautiful picture. World of harmony, of interdependence, etc. Then one fine day there's violence between the Hindus and the Muslims. And the school headmaster, who is a very respected person, goes there to stop. Many of these are his students. So they stop the moment he tells them to stop this nonsense. But then when he turns back, they kill him. They kill him and two of his students. And as Jyotirmoy says, Jai Ma Kali, it's not Kali, that is a typo. Jai Ma Kali and Allahu Akbar war cries fill the night sky with venom spreading into the arteries. Ram Dao, daggers, swords, and tridents are out. So we can understand the extreme conditions of threat to their very existence under which they live. Is this the home they want to go back to? No. So what is this home they're talking about? Homelessness. Found a home in Marichapi. What kind of a home is it? If home was what they ran away from. Mariana Ortega, you'll remember, makes a distinction. I don't know whether I talked about that, but it's there in the notes. I probably missed it because of the lack of time. At my back, I always hear Time's winged chariot hurrying near to make it sound very literary and very poetic. So she says, there is a distinction in the refugees' experience between the home as reality and the home as image, or what she calls myth. What home comes to signify in the condition of unhomeliness of refuge, what home comes to signify is not the real home. It is an imagined home that has been, that has been expunged of all the traces of fear and threat. It is an idyllic image that they have. And what they feel rooted to is that home. So when she is saying place rootedness, she is not talking about place as essence. Because this is a place that does not exist except in nostalgia, except in memory. Okay. Now that is the kind of home that these people are talking about. Not the real home in East Pakistan or Bangladesh that they had to flee. So when they perform home tactics, it is that home they are trying to reconstruct. And they I think somewhere I have just one second. I kind of forgot to include that. This is actually on page 42 of Jyotirmoy Mondal's narrative. I mentioned this earlier. They're celebrating Poush Mela in Dandakaranya. Poush Mela. Back in their Bangla, it used to be a season of celebration. Here too, Bengali refugees from nearby camps have set up a tent in the distance. Kobigan, that's songs of Tagore, Kobigan is being recited all day. At night, they arrange a bioscope, Sitar Bonobas, or the banishment of Sita. These are tactics through which they try to reconstruct that sense of home, that imagined home, not the real home, not home as reality. What are tactics? Ortega makes a distinction between tactics and strategy, following somebody called Michel de Certeau, Practice of Everyday Life. Michel de Certeau says strategies are basically calculated measures aimed at achieving an ultimate goal. They are the techniques of the powerful. Tactics are improvisations, spontaneous. They do not have an immediate goal. I mean, they do not have any ultimate goal. They want to immediately produce a favorable situation. They don't try to transform a situation. Tactics are the techniques of the powerless. So when Ortega uses the term home tactics as distinct from home strategy, as distinct from strategy, it is all these meanings that she is trying to capture. Home tactics as a kind of improvisation. Improvisation of something that is not part of the here of their reality, which is a part of the imagined their Bangla, of that imagined home, which would reconstruct in memory and ritual, in rhythms. Poush Mela is about rhythms, seasonal rhythms. It's a harvest festival. In rhythms, that Bangla. He also tells us how when they were in the Jogeshwar Dihi camp, his mother Rangabu plants bottle gourd seeds just outside their tent. And where did she get these seeds from? She carried these seeds all the way from their village. Now these are what Ortega calls home tactics. They are more symbolic than practical. They are more affective than rational. what they produce is an affect, an emotional sense of being at ease. She talks about familiarity, being at ease, etc., which are emotional, not a calculated, reasoned plan of action. Now, I'd like to bring in here, in very simple ways, I'll try to explain it as simply as I can, a very important theory in what came to be later called human geography. This is Henri Lefebvre. I mentioned him in the morning today in the production of space. Lefebvre is talking about social space. That is our understanding of space as our lived reality. And he says that social space does not coincide with physical space, the space that is studied by architects and map makers. Social space is something very different. Social space is produced. Social space is not a given. It is not a given. It is not a container in which people and objects exist. It is the outcome of our relationship to space. And how does this relationship come to happen? It happens through the things that we do in that space, the activities that we carry out habitually, which he calls spatial practices. It is that which invests a social meaning into what would otherwise be physical space. So what is it that we are doing in this physical space that makes it very different from your bedroom? That makes it very different from your classroom? That makes it very different from a mall? That makes it very different from a temple, church, or masjid? What is it that we're doing here? Understand? Now, these are things that are not calculated. That's why it says habitual practices. Habits are things that we are never conscious of till somebody makes us aware of them. So what are the things you do in a particular space that would make it a home space, or a work space, or a space of recreation, a shopping mall, a temple or church or masjid, a park or garden, an urban space, a rural space? So spaces are never homogeneous. They're only homogenized on maps, blueprints, layouts. Spaces are remarkably heterogeneous. Every space carries its meanings, which are habitual and affective, and more importantly, he says bodily. He says space is something that we inhabit in our bodily existence. So he talks about what he calls the embodiment of space. The body and the space are so inseparably connected that we even fail to notice that connection till we reflect upon it. Okay, now that's precisely what's happening here. It is not through reflection that Mana Goldar talks about the taste of fish caught fresh from the river and eaten with steaming hot rice. It is not with reflection that Kusum is talking about the touch of mud and how the touch of mud is different from the touch of cold iron rails. It's not with reflection that Jyotirmoy Safal Haldar is talking about the smell of the tide water, the sight of the Padma-kissed land. Okay, these are not things done with reflection. They're so much a habitual part of ourselves in their embodied form that the body automatically moves like that. There's a very important term in a cultural theorist called Pierre Bourdieu. The term it is habitus. It's a term that he takes, interestingly, from Marcel Mauss. Marcel Mauss, who wrote The Gift, also wrote a very, very interesting essay called Techniques of the Body. L'accord du technique. a very early essay, 1940s, 1930s or something, where he first introduces this term, habitus. He says that the body, we occupy spaces in certain embodied positions, gestures, which are very natural. So, for example, to use a rather vulgar example, it's very natural for a person from a particular culture, from a particular period, to perform his daily ablutions squatting. Somebody else would need a little throne. These are unreflected. The body automatically takes up that position. There's no planning that's going on. That's what mouse means. There is a certain way that people of a more privileged class walk that differentiates them from the way people belonging to lower socioeconomic classes walk. There are certain ways in which one uses one's body to express meaning as a man, as a woman, as an upper class, etc., etc. These are not natural, properties of the body. These are cultural, kind of ingrained. Okay, that's what he means by habitus, and that's precisely what Bourdieu is also talking about as habitus. Certain preferred, habitual, or predisposed ways of relating to our social conditions that become learned as cultural, learned and ingrained as cultural memory. And that is precisely what these people are talking about, their sensuous experience of the home space. Now, I have this quotation there from Lefebvre, vis-a-vis lived experience, etc. I'm not going to read that through, but I'm going to explain what he means. So what Lefebvre is saying is that our understanding and our experience of space, the way we make sense of the spaces that we inhabit, is through concrete, lived experience. It's in a lived relation to space. It is not an abstract understanding of space that we find, for example, in maps and blueprints, in layouts. Its very concreteness is evidenced by the fact that we never reflect upon it. We never become aware of it even. That is, it is never abstracted in thought. It is never rendered abstract through reflection. It is something that is perceived in our bodily engagements with space. Now, why I am laboring this point is the importance of these sensuous images in the descriptions of home in Blood Island, which are absolutely lacking in Arendt. Arendt talks of home, she begins with home. We lost our home. But it's a very different kind of home from the home here that we are looking at. Now it is, I would argue, because of this consciousness of home space, that they are, in a sense, rooted in, but not really rooted in, because it is an imagined space. It's an imagined place. It is not grounded anywhere. It is rootless itself, in itself. And therefore, there is no kind of essentializing of home place here. Because they know that the real home is one that they will never go back to. They cannot go back to. So, what I'm trying to do is really make connections between, one, their perception of that space, two, their social consciousness. We are the dispossessed. We are humanity's leftovers. Which then enables the step to political consciousness, the politicization of their condition where he says, as he says, we fought with fire in our souls, even after a year of people dying by the dozens. So where does this end? It's time for me to end also. Where does this end? It ends in the massacre. It ends in these people forced back to Dandakaranya. Most of them at least. But does that end thereby completely erase the meanings that have already accumulated in the narrative? I don't think it does. I think what that end does is it brings to us a very radical awareness of the refugee's paradoxical condition. As I said in the morning, the refugee occupies a cruel spatial paradox. He lives in a land he does not belong to. He cannot belong to. In the case of these Morijhapi refugees, he belongs to a land that he can no longer live in. It is in this enigma of living and belonging to spaces that the refugee's story unfolds. Hence the refugee's reduction to bare life, to what Arendt calls mere human being. The refugee's space, the refugee belongs to a space which I would call the symbolic no man's land of the internment camp. It's a land where law withdraws. And anything can be performed, anything can be done with impunity by anyone. So what happens in the camp that they live in Dandakaranya? Bribes are, as he says, the only currency. You want to till some soil, you have to pay bribe. You want a doctor, you have to pay bribe. You have to pay bribes for everything. This is done with impunity. Bribes collected by the camp officials, by the guards. A woman can be raped by the guards who are assigned to protect them, again with impunity. People can be killed, their bodies disposed of. No investigation warranted. No investigation started, no investigation warranted. The absolute withdrawal of law from the space of the internment camp. That is the space the refugee belongs to. That's the only space the refugee can belong to. That's the meaning of the ending of their journey and their attempt to settle Morijhapi. Let me end with one of my favorite stories of the partition. Sadat Hassan Manto, was a refugee. Manto lived in Bombay. He was part of the film industry. He used to write scripts. And then when communal riots broke out in Bombay with a very heavy heart, he realized that he could no longer live there and he went back to Lahore. But his heart was in Bombay. His heart always remained in Bombay. So this is a story called Toba Tek Singh. Some of you may have read it. This is partition, and therefore everything is being distributed, some to India, some to Pakistan. Files are changed, officials are distributed, etc. Those Hindus who want to go to India, brought to India. Those Muslims who want to go to Pakistan, taken to Pakistan. Those jail inmates who want to come to India, brought here, and same with the others. And then there are the asylum, mental asylum inmates, the lunatics, who don't exercise a choice, no option, because they are non compos mentis, no capacity to exercise a choice. For them it's compulsory. There's this particular inmate called Bisham Singh in the Lahore mental asylum. And they tell him, you'll have to go to India. He says, India? What is India? I will go to Toba Tek Singh, my village. They said, no, you'll have to go to India. So I will go to India if Toba Tek Singh is in India. Tell me, where is Toba Tek Singh? Nobody knows, some unknown village that this Sird comes from. So, and the inmates, his other friends, they confuse him completely. Some of them say, Toba Tek Singh is in Pakistan. Some say, no, it's in India. Some say it was in Pakistan, but it has slid into India. Some say, no, it slid back again into Pakistan. Some others express the fear that one fine day India and Pakistan will disappear from the map of the world and there will be no Toba Tek Singh. So in this absolute confusion, he is herded into a truck and taken to the border. The Pakistani guards tell him, go to India. He says, no, I don't want to go to India. I want to go to Toba Tek Singh. They want to get rid of this fellow. This fellow has become a nuisance. They realize he's a harmless old man. So they push him across the barbed wire. And he stands there on no man's land, on his swollen legs like a colossus, as Manto puts it, in no man's land. Lets out a very loud cry and collapses, falls dead. The story ends with these lines. There, behind the barbed wire, on one side lay India, and behind more barbed wire, on the other side lay Pakistan. In between, on a bit of earth which had no name, lay Toba Tek Singh. Toba Tek Singh the man, because that's what they call him. He keeps on talking about Toba Tek Singh, so they nickname him Toba Tek Singh. Toba Tek Singh the man, Toba Tek Singh the land are merged. It is in this ironic figure of the merging of man and land that come to be tied the story of the partition and the story of refuge that it generated. Probably some other time we can talk of the partition. That's it, end. Questions? Any questions, comments?
We have enough time for a couple of questions. Quick questions.
Thank you for the insightful lecture, sir. I wanted to ask was, I could see through the theoretical framework as well as the literary texts we read, the domain of refugee studies, or I would say in a broader sense as we talked about humanities and the representation of the refugee experience in humanities. The refugee experience overlaps with many other experiences. For example, when we talked about refugees kind of being in a neither nor position, I could relate with Frantz Fanon talking about the lost world. They are kind of similar to that. I could also find it overlap with the diaspora, right? So I would particularly want to ask, do you think refugee studies is an extension to diaspora, or it's kind of different and has some overlaps?
Well, to begin with Fanon, since you mentioned Fanon, if your reference is to the wretched of the earth, Fanon is not really talking about refugee there, because these people are not refugees. He's talking about decolonization. And he's talking about decolonization as not simply a kind of political condition, but also a very spatial condition. When you read The Wretched of the Earth, it is this kind of underlying spatiality, almost as an undertone, that you cannot help but hear, that goes through the entire this thing. Because it did, in fact, concern space, because what was decolonized was fundamentally a space. But he is not talking about the condition of refuge, and he is not drawing a comparison because they are very different. See, the condition of diaspora, I made that distinction. The condition of diaspora is very different from the condition of refuge. The diasporic is one who does not live in the land he belongs to, but nothing prevents him to return to the land of belonging. The refugee is the one who lives in the land he does not belong to, but can never return to the land of his belonging. The citizen lives in the land that he belongs to. The diasporic lives in a different land, but can always return to the land of belonging. For the refugee, neither is possible. That is why I said the cruel spatial paradox of the refugee. He lives in a land that he does not belong to. He belongs to a land that he can no longer live in. So we need to make that distinction. See, your point about refugee studies as being an extension of migration studies, yes. Egon Kunz's essay was published in a migration studies journal. There wasn't a refugee studies journal by 1981 when he published this essay, but that's a different matter. One history of refugee studies that I have read, not one, about two or so, which is the only history of refugee studies that I've read, but my take on it is very different, says refugee studies emerged as an extension of migration studies. If it did, it's very unfortunate. And I think many of the problems implicit in refugee theory, in the conceptual frameworks of refugee studies, stem from that fact. It's a matter of regret that it emerged as an extension of migration studies rather than an area of inquiry in its own right. I don't know whether that answers your question.
So, sir, you talked about the displacement and also the Lefebvrean idea of the production of space, and also you talked about the idea of home. So can you differentiate or relate the concepts of the place, space and home?
Well, that's really what I was trying to do. See, the concept of home that we have in refugee studies, and especially the very important sense that Mariana Ortega gives to it, home as myth, the home as a kind of imagined reality, that is a concept of not space as an abstract, surface, but of space concretized in particular locations, what we call place. In human geography, that is studies of space, a distinction is made between place and space, where space is our more abstract concept of a surface, what you get on a map. A map maps space. But the particular neighborhood you come from does not exist as a map in your mind. It exists as a concrete space of habitation, where every corner carries memories, some bad, some good. So some corners you love to frequent, some corners you avoid, where every element of that space becomes invested with meaning, becomes meaningful. That's not a map. It's not color-coded. Okay, so place is the idea of that concrete space of habitation. Now, with regard to that sense of space, what Lefebvre calls lived space, lived reality, space as lived reality in that quotation from Production of Space, becomes lived reality in terms of what we do in it. What are the things that we do in it? That comes to invest it with the meaning of home, or the meaning of office, or the meaning of shopping mall, or the meaning of temple, mosque and masjid, etc. The meaning is not there in the structure of bricks and cement. The meaning emerges out of the way we inhabit, the practices of habitation. What are the things we do in it? What are the things that we do in a temple or church or masjid that makes it a sacred place? Sacredness is not a property of the physical material of the structure. Okay. Now these practices that Lefebvre calls spatial practices, the practices that produce spaces as lived reality, are comparable or analogous to what Ortega calls home tactics. I say analogous, not exactly the same, because the contexts are very different. Lefebvre is not talking about refugee. So Lefebvre is not confining his examples to home alone. He talks about gardens, he talks about reserve forests, nature parks, he talks about the village, the church, etc., etc. Whereas Ortega is using that idea in a specific context, the context of the refugee. I haven't come across in Ortega's work that I have read any reference to Lefebvre, but I think our argument would have benefited very strongly from the production of space.
We have time for one more question, one last question.
Hello. Yeah, sir, I was thinking about one point which you said differentiates the refugee of, let's say, a place like Murichapi with like what like Karen talks about in her conception of how the identity of the refugee works. So, what, as the example that you gave, what the residents of Murichapi exclaimed in protest at the police boats when they were blocked, right? So drawing from that, you said that the refugee belongs to a land, a symbolic no man's land, right? He belongs to a place he can't live. So I was thinking, drawing from that, can we also then, does that also make us think about the question of the idea of who is a refugee, or what is the idea of a refugee itself? Because the refugee as an identity cannot be collective, right? The moment it becomes a collective, it also then becomes a larger entity, like a group of Hindu or a Muslim, or like upper caste, and then it becomes subject to some countries where they want to take them or not, like we see with the Rohingya Muslims, right? Or as in the case of Morichapi, as we saw. So I was thinking, how in the case of refugee studies, how do you often align the personal or the individual cases of trauma with this idea of a collective class or caste identity of the refugee? Like, in a way, like, is there an ontological thought process behind the term refugee itself?
Yeah, let me see if I have been able to understand your question. First is, I think you're saying, can we think of a distinct category called the refugee? And in the morning session I said no. There are refugees. There isn't the refugee. This is a category that's marked by so much of heterogeneity. One seeks refuge for different reasons, because there's a tsunami, because there's there's persecution, because there's war, because there's an earthquake, because of extreme poverty. So there are a whole lot of different reasons for it, because of which, people have begun to prefer the term forced migration rather than refuge. Forced migration or forced displacement studies, to distinguish it from voluntary migration or diasporic movement. Then why do we need the term refugee? See, let me give you an example. in a certain kind of radical politics. What happens is that the people who are socially excluded take on the very term that signifies their stigma. You take the example of the term gay or the term queer. The term gay was a military slang in the US, used to stigmatize, used pejoratively against people who were homosexually oriented. And similarly, the term queer. When these movements began, they picked on these terms. So they didn't say, we are the alt-sex, alternative sexualities. We are the multi-sex, multiplicit sexualities. They said we are gay or we are queer. Now what is the politics behind taking on such a term? I think the answer lies if we reflect on Arendt's term conscious pariah. Who is a conscious pariah? One who uses the designation pariah consciously to challenge the conditions that produce him or her as pariah. And that is precisely how the term Udbastu, refugee, is being used in Blood Island. So Udbastu is not a stigmatizing term that they internalize in themselves. It is a term that they consciously, politically use in order to bring to the fore the unjust and unethical conditions of them being perceived as Udbastu, the uprooted, the dispossessed. Understand? So it is not a term that indicates a self-denigration or a self-abjection. It is a term that they fling back to the dominant cultures that name them thus. Okay, so we need to use the term refugee with that critical valence. Otherwise, refugee would be a stigmatizing term. Remember that incident where this boy goes, he is thirsty, he goes to a house in a nearby locality, they are not refugees. And he asks for water, and this woman turns around and tells the other woman, oh, I thought he was a refugee, but it appears he is a normal boy. So she was using the term in that pejorative sense. Is that what you meant? Okay, okay.
On that note, thank you so much, Dr. Das. We'll conclude the session.
Sure.
Thank you so much for that fascinating, wide-ranging, comprehensive lecture. Thank you so much. A huge round of applause for Dr. Das, please. Before we conclude the symposium, we have a short feedback session, which is your opportunity of telling us how you felt, as in what you thought of the symposium. If there's something you wanted to share with us, your thoughts on the sessions, the speakers, the food, the stay, whatever, the campus, this is your opportunity. You can maybe quickly tell us what you felt about the symposium.
Do I continue in the witness box here?
Your response is your feedback to the symposium. We know you're tired, but then...
So I'm here from Christ, as some people know. So So just I was saying, like the food and everything was good, but I came up for the content of the whole symposium and absolutely enjoyed it, because the theory is usually inculcated within our syllabus, but we don't have particular symposium based on these topics. It usually goes on. So I really like the fact that we could actually base it on primary text, fictional text or non-fictional text, which are usually missing from our curriculums, I would say. So these aspects were very much enlightening, I would say. because like we usually have the knowledge of theory but not how to apply it. So the application was phenomenal by the like such professors, I would say. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Bilal. Thank you. Anyone else? If you speak, we'll click your pictures, as you saw Bilal having his picture clicked. So if that is incentive enough. Should I now offer to put your pictures on social media? No more comments, responses, feedback?
Alright, so I am here from Kashmir, like the campus in Srinagar. I would say the academia, the entire academia in Kashmir is like really the void there is that you don't get theory at all. Like Bilal said, there's a lot of theory, but there's no primary text you use theory on. But in our case, there are just text and no theory. Post MA, you get to learn theory. In BA, no one knows theory. I had to study it on my own. And so obviously I wasn't able to study it in this way, this diverse way. When I came here, I got to know about the more contemporary and new versions of theory, like refugee studies isn't really much touched upon even in the MA there. So, or eco-criticism, it was like very contemporary fields of theory. I got to know a lot about it, and most importantly, I got to know from multiple perspectives. What I liked about the sessions was almost all of them were two-way. Like it was really engaging. You took questions, and we were kind of able to have that two-way connection. And I got to know about the insights from other people. The best part of the symposium was I got to know a lot of other people from other colleges, and it was kind of really nice and really diverse. I would appreciate other such symposiums in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Zora. Now, before we end, we have a formal vote of thanks by the principal investigator, Professor Anna Kurin.
This is the part which cannot be skipped, because this is when we say our thank yous to everybody from Vice Chancellor Town, to Ramesh the dog, whom many of you don't know. But we have to say our thank yous because, yeah, good manners, but also in the hope that all the thank yous will help them to then continue helping us. Let me begin with our team of volunteers. They're right here, most of them. My two favorites are the food providers, Saurav and Noah. Right? They are the ones who decide the menu. They are the ones who go get the food. See? And then they have this army of people who help them. So then in that army, there is Shaheem, who is like currently standing by to take on leading roles shortly. Right? So if Saurav and Noah are not there, I think it'll be Shaheem. Then there is Roy, Khushbu, Megha today, who stepped up when Meenakshi fell ill. We kind of coerced her. So I don't think I can call her a volunteer unless there's a category called a forced volunteer, in which case she is that. Right? So Megha helped us. And then, of course, there's Khushbu and Supratik. Supratik, who set up the WhatsApp group for all of you. So things like that, the small things which actually make this whole affair come together. Then there is the staff. So we have the technical staff here in the auditorium who worked with all this equipment, which, as you saw this morning, we couldn't figure it out. Meenakshi was not there, and we were scrambling. But yeah, eventually we got the act together. Then our videographers who come to us time after time, who stand patiently. I don't know what they make of it, but they're very kind to us. So I should be grateful. The Department of English office staff, always there, always helpful. The housekeeping and cleaning staff here, as well as at the guest house, as well as in my department. The staff of the Lakeview guest house, who again are fairly kind, make some efforts to be helpful. Then there is Murli, who came yesterday morning, our head of the department. He is very encouraging for everything that we do. Let me at this point now go right up to the top, the Vice Chancellor himself, who gives us our approvals repeatedly in many cases, because every time we give him a list of speakers, then 3 people will drop out, 4 will say, we cannot come at this time, we will come at different dates. So then we keep writing letters. Every time the VC will check with us, sign it eventually. The finance officer who clears our bills. Yes, we will draw a veil over that one. And then there are others in the administration who help us. Mr. Krishnaram, who is the OSD to the Vice Chancellor, our PRO, Ashish, Mr. Sai Jawar, who is the Deputy Registrar in charge of the HR cell, etc. All of them make a very concerted effort to help us to make sure that our work gets done. Some of it is because they're all Pramod's friends, but nonetheless, they still help us. Right? And now I come to the two main sets of people, right? So one is, of course, the speakers, the last of whom is still here with us, Dilip. But also Swarnalata, Neerja, Bibhash, all of them who put in an effort to do the work, come prepared, make sure that you all learned something. And whether they had PPTs, they didn't have PPTs, whether they gave handouts like Professor Das, extremely generous, a lot of work went into that. And to have come ready, no? Like, here. He did not even say, please Xerox this and we have it ready. He just brought the whole thing. That's kind of incredible in this day and age. So, I think, it was amazing. Watching that this morning, it was like goosebumps all over. Like, oh my gosh, who gets this kind of good luck? Right? So our speakers. And then, of course, all of you. Several of you are from my own department. So let me gloss over that. But that you came, you sat, I hope you learned. And then those who came from outside, you put in, a short notice, you got tickets. You wrote those funny write-ups about the women in Dutch painting poem, right? It's one of my favorite poems, but yeah, you wrote write-ups. And then those of you who came from outside, you're sacrificing classes, I assume, wherever you study. You've taken time out from your own schedules to come here. We're very grateful. Because if it wasn't for you, none of this would be happening. My final three people, whom I thank every time, and I don't think there are words enough for that. Two, of course, Meenakshi, whom all of you know, right? All mails come signed Meenakshi, or the other one, Atul. Right? Without them, there would be no IWA online, there would be no symposium, there would be actually nothing. I would be lolling in some corner reading a book, and nothing would be happening. They are the guys who do all the work. And then, of course, Pramod, who is currently not here, but Pramod. Right? The three of them put together are the ones who make my work. I don't do any work apart from put in signatures. They do all the work. So thank you very much, all of you, for coming here. I forgot one group. All the PhDs who come, they may not volunteer, but there's this bunch of PhDs who do a lot of work for us. They make posters sometimes for us. They run around. When you have an emergency, you just find the nearest PhD person and say, please, 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 and they'll run. So that way, how can I forget my entire PhD corner out there? So thank you very much, all of you. I hope we have more opportunities like this, and safe travels to those who are going back to your hometowns. Thank you.